guys, so I'm here today to do my end of February reading wrap up. I'm going to give you mini reviews of all the books that I read in February, so without further ado, let's get into the books. Let's kick things off with my first 5-star read of the year, and that is Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is a proof copy from Bloomsbury, but the actual book is not out until April, so this is a little bit of a heads up on a book to keep your eye out for, but it is a highly recommended heads up. I loved this book. This is my first experience with Madeline Miller's writing, but it's not the first Greek myth retelling that she has written. This book is focused on the life of Cersei. Cersei was a sorceress, a witch, and a daughter of the titan Helios, god of the sun, so also a goddess. Some of her most famous incidents in Greek myth are her appearance in the Odyssey, where Odysseus spends some time on her island with her and she turns his soldiers into pigs. Is one of the quite famous images of Cersei the witch, but a lot more happens to Cersei in Greek mythology, and Madeline Miller has brought that all together. She has taken all the myths involving Cersei and strung them together in a coherent linear narrative that takes us through the sorceress's life. I just thought Madeline Miller completely brought this character to life for me. She made her such a fully well-rounded, cohesive character. Now, of course, if somebody chooses to characterise a character from mythology in a specific way, taking into account all the different incidents involving them, but trying to make them make sense alongside one another, they are choosing to characterise them in a specific way. A lot of Greek myths can sometimes sit alongside one another quite contradictory, or characters can be characterised in very different ways in different myths, and gods don't always act in the way that we expect humans to act, that it makes sense according to who they are. It can be a little bit all over the place. So Madeline Miller has obviously put her own spin on this, but I think she made it work within the context of Greek mythology. I really think she did a wonderful job, and Cersei is a character who I knew some myths about. I had read the Odyssey, for example, but I actually didn't know all of the little incidents of her life, and I did find myself reading bits of this book and then looking them up online to refresh my memory and just remind myself of how that had been recorded in Greek mythology. And it was just a really wonderful, absorbing reading experience, and you certainly don't have to have read any Greek myth to read this. Like I'm saying, I didn't know I was not that familiar with some of Cersei's myths, so that did not impact my reading of this book at all. Of course, if you are interested in Greek mythology, that adds a whole new layer, but it's actually just a wonderful story about this goddess's life. She finds out she's a sorceress when she's younger and is banished to the island of Aea to live alone, but she then, through various different instances, meets different people, and it's about how she shapes her own life and finds who she is as an individual, and I just absolutely adored it. If you are interested in Greek myth retellings, however, since this one's not out till April, I do have an entire video dedicated to books retelling Greek and Roman myths, so you can check that out in the meantime. I listened to 2 audiobooks in the month of February, the first of which was Persuasion by Jane Austen. This is my 3rd Jane Austen novel. I previously have read Northanger Abbey and Mansfield Park. I really enjoyed this one. What can I say? I haven't not enjoyed a Jane Austen yet. They are pretty consistent in my enjoyment. They are really nice, comforting reads that kind of take you into this historical setting and away from the world you're living in, but at the same time are incredibly relatable despite being set in the early 1800s. It just goes to show that certain themes surrounding things like relationships are very timeless. At the same time, they are very much of their time. They are set in a time in which women were very much second-class citizens, and you can see Jane Austen attempting to kind of highlight some of the ways in which women are confined in their period through these novels. And Persuasion focuses on Anne Elliot, who is a woman in her... She's not old, but she's painted as old in the book because she's not yet married and is perhaps in her mid to late 20s, and she rejected a marriage proposal from a man she was in love with when she was younger, but was persuaded by a family member that he wasn't of a high enough station for them, and she, like I mentioned, rejected him. It's now many years later and she comes back in contact with Frederick Wentworth, but it seems very much that he does not like her. He harbours a grudge against her after her previous rejection, and it's about her dealing with her feelings and this new Frederick and all the other sort of family and friend and relationship politics that are going on around her. Very like nice, quaint but absorbing story, and I am just thoroughly enjoying my Jane Austen journey. I then listened to Dear Ija Welly, or A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is a very short little book and is very much a follow-up to her previous book, We Should All Be Feminists. It's incredibly basic and simple. So if you have read tons and tons and tons of feminist theory and scholarship and what have you, you probably don't need to read this. It's not going to give you anything new. But if you have read tons of stuff and still just like to read these little basic books, because I think they can just really hone it back and remind you of why sort of feminism and the fight for gender equality is so important, then I would totally recommend it. And if you haven't read anything at all about feminism, I would also recommend it. I think it is actually better than We Should All Be Feminists, but then again, We Should All Be Feminists is even more basic. So when I read We Should All Be Feminists, it was just too simple for me, but I think Dear Ija Welly was slightly more. I think it had slightly more in it. I think it's slightly longer, so that's not that surprising. So it's still one I would highly, highly recommend. I think it was a really nice, concise exploration of the importance of feminism, the importance of gender equality, and specifically about raising children in a gender neutral, equal way in which we don't enforce sexism on them, that we teach young girls that they shouldn't feel that they can't do things because they're women, and so on and so forth, because this is addressed as a letter to Chimamanda's sister, who has recently had a daughter, and Chimamanda is giving her advice upon her request for raising a feminist daughter. Part of it is so interesting to me because I feel very much that I was raised as a feminist. I never questioned the idea that I was a feminist, because in my house being a feminist always just meant that you believed in gender equality and recognised that it was yet to be attained and that there was stuff to do in order to attain that. And it was always taught to me by both my parents that of course there was no difference between the sexes, of course they should be treated equally, and why shouldn't I stand up and demand it when I see inequality in existence. So I have never questioned that I've been a feminist, but in saying that, it's really interesting to reflect perhaps on the way that my parents did raise me and think more in depth about it, because they did not necessarily raise me in what is the typical fashion, and I am so grateful to them for that. And this book was a reminder of that for me, and a reminder that in the future I want to actively promote that to my own children. And just a nice little articulate book on the topic, which I think are always nice to read because I think they help you articulate your own thoughts in discussions with others, and that's always a good thing. I got that wrong. I actually listened to 3 audiobooks in February. The third one was The Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince by Robin Hobb. This is part of Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings series, which is set in the fantasy universe that she's created, and it's numbered 0.5, so it has come out after most of the other books in this series, or at least the ones that have been released, but it is set before the events of all of these books, because it is essentially the folk tale or legend behind some of the aspects of that world. It is like a fairy tale or a legend that people will tell each other many years on. So it's very much part of the world building of this fantasy realm. And you learn about the Willful Princess, who had an affair with the stable master and bore his child, who then went on to become the Piebald Prince. And you go through this journey. Now this is quite a nice book because it's a short novella more than anything else that could be a great introduction to the series, and it's also just a nice little extra for those of you that are already enjoying the series. So I really enjoyed reading that. It's been a while since I've read anything by Robin Hobb, and it was a little bit easier than committing to starting one of her other series set in this world, because it is just a little standalone book. So I really enjoyed that, and it just built upon the world for me and was just a nice little fantasy tale. I can't say much more about it, but I enjoyed listening to it. I then read in full 3 of these little Penguin Modern Classics books, which have just come out and are £1 each. I did a whole video on them, so I will link that if you're interested. And I recommended 10 authors from the Modern Classics that I really enjoyed, including these 3. However, I hadn't read these specific works by those authors, so I wanted to read them before the video, and I did so and really enjoyed them. So the first one I had already read some of the books by, and that was John Steinbeck. This is 3 short stories by John Steinbeck, and I've previously read Of Mice and Men. This I really enjoyed. It reminded me how good a writer John Steinbeck was. He really was a fantastic writer, and he really gets inside your head with what he writes. Some of the stories in this are very disturbing and turn your stomach and make you feel uncomfortable. And I still think I definitely prefer John Steinbeck as a novelist, but I think this was a wonderful little sampler of his writing and just reminded me, like I said, how good a writer he is and how much I want to read more of his novels. So that's definitely something I intend on doing in the near future after having this little bit of a kick in the behind. My favourite probably of the ones I read recently was James Baldwin's Dark Days, and these are non-fiction essays by James Baldwin, who was around again in the 20th century and wrote on the topic of race in America, in particular the history of racism, racism in like the American institutes and systemic racism, and the impact that slavery still had during the time that he was alive. And it was just such an interesting book. Although it's obviously about the time James Baldwin's living in, which is the sort of mid 1900s, it's very, very relevant today, and James Baldwin articulates his points really well in this little book, so this is one in particular I would highly recommend spending your £1 on. And lastly, The 3 Electronites by Stanisław Lem, which is a collection of 20th century Polish science fiction stories by the author, obviously translated into English as I don't read Polish, but again, really enjoyed this one. So Lem is actually an author who my dad was a big fan of. He really enjoyed his science fiction, and an author I've wanted to read. I pretty much just want to read all of the authors that my dad was a fan of. It's a way of me feeling close to him, and it was really nice to finally be reading some of his short stories, having been meaning to for a while. So I really enjoyed these. I thought they were beautifully written, and they were very much in the vein of fairy tales. So they had this structure like fairy tales. Like one of the stories, The 3 Electronites, you get one sort of robot made of one material coming to try and complete this quest, then a second robot in a different material coming to complete the quest, then a third, and each one sort of having their own turn. And they reminded me of traditional fairy tales, these patterns and plots and structures, but they are set in futuristic, otherworldly science fiction worlds that are incredibly imaginative, and I loved that. I thought it was a beautiful combination of things. It just totally converted me to the author's writing, and will definitely be taking some of his other work off of my dad's bookshelf to read in the future. But those are all the things I completed in the month of February. I am in the process of reading a few other things at the moment, and I'm sure there will be another currently reading video coming your way soon, so I can chat about that with you all. But if you have any thoughts on any of the books I've mentioned in this video, I would love to hear them, so do leave them down below. But until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!